Sound check, Shannon. Can you hear me?
Hi, Rachel. Yes, I can hear you fine.
Great. Good to hear you. John, you might be on mute.
How about now?
You're good now.
Thanks.
John, with the light behind you, kind of darkens your face, so you might need to close those, although it's beautiful behind you.
This could be better. Better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. Reporting from Alta, Utah.
Shut up. I'm so jealous. How is it?
Well, I mean, other than a change of scenery, it's remarkably similar to Aspen. You know, it hasn't snowed here since New Year's Day either.
Is it supposed to snow tomorrow there?
It's snowing lightly right now, but we're leaving tomorrow, so
no.
No, we're not predicted to get anything here, so.
Oh, that's a bummer. I'm supposed to be heading there Friday morning, but it may not happen. Where are you staying?
This friend of mine was in charge of everything, and he rented us get this, condo available through Airbnb, and it's right above the Snowbird tram, but you can call
above.
Yeah, we're right above the Snowbird. Yeah, and yeah, you can ski down to it from here. It's ski in, ski out. So we're actually at Snowbird. Yeah, but just around the corner from Alta, literally.
So it was pretty much meant to be resort lodging, being on the mountain. And,
totally. Yes.
And we're getting a little bit of light snow here too, John. I don't know if anything's going to come of it or not, but it's always nice to see it.
Yeah.
I'm going to just very quick run to the restroom, guys. It'll take me 1 minute.
Okay.
Take more than 1 minute, Skippy. Gee.
Yeah. Take your time.
2 minutes at least.
With GrassRoots, can y'all hear me? Real quick. I turned the closed captioning on for the YouTube stream, so unfortunately, even though the audio is not going out over YouTube, it is translating to closed captioning right now. So I'm not sure exactly how to turn that off without stopping everything. Just FYI.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
He's back. John, did you ski Alta each day, or did you ski Snowbird too?
Since we are staying at Snowbird, we started at Snowbird, skied there our first day, went to Alta yesterday, and today being our last day, we decided to go back to Alta because the snow was better.
Got it. I've heard that Alta is doing a limit on skiers per day up the lift, but that the very easy hack is just to enter from Snowbird and go across because they don't check that entrance.
It's been years since I've been here before, but Mineral Basin off the backside and the interconnect and that Peruvian tunnel, all new to me. I'm not sure how they keep the snowboarders out of Alta, but they do. And I can tell you what, it was cold today, super cold.
Yeah.
It was cold here.
Yeah.
It doesn't
Woke up
surprise
to
me.
0. It was 0 in town this morning.
Ah, see, yeah.
Got negatives on
Yeah.
the way the next 2 days.
Mhm.
Mayor and meteorologist. That's nice. And alliterative.
Look, you know my past job, so yeah. You betcha. All right, guys. I was waiting for a moment to see if Ward was going to be jumping on with us. I'm not seeing him right now, but it is a couple minutes after the hour. So we're going to go ahead and get started. If GrassRoots is ready and with us.
GrassRoots is ready.
All right, thanks so much. I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us this evening. This is the Aspen City Council work session for February 1, 2022. Everybody, hold on. This year is screaming by. And our work session this evening has to do with some of the moratorium and subject matter there, kind of getting a game plan laid out before us. So with no further ado, I see Ben and I see Philip. I'm going to turn it over to them to start introducing tonight's work session.
Hi, Mr. Mayor. For the record, Ben Anderson, planner with Community Development. Is it okay if I share my screen?
Go right ahead.
And immediately upon doing that, I'm going to Philip.
Okay.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Mayor and Council. For the record, my name is Philip Sapino. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Aspen. And it is our intention tonight to have a robust discussion around work, Community Development Department, along with some of our sister agencies we'll be undertaking during the 2022 residential and short-term rental moratorium. Next slide, please, Ben. Thank you. So just a couple of kind of big picture statements to kick off the discussion this evening. First of all, again, we are operating under the emergency declaration that Council put into effect with Ordinance 27 on December 8th of 2021. That was a large statement by the City Council on behalf of the community about the state of a number of overlapping topics that Council has been exploring with city staff and with the community for a number of months, even years now. And those really fall into four categories: short-term rentals, climate and the environment, the pace and scale of residential development activities, and the alignment with those activities, and some of the dynamics we see around short-term rentals in our community. And that emergency declaration was in large part a statement again by City Council that the dynamics around some of those topics in our community in the aggregate have created a circumstance where our regulations and how they manifest in the built environment are not supporting many of council and the community's adopted policies around some of those topic areas. And so it's our charge during this moratorium period to assist council in seeking that alignment, seeking further alignment between those policies and the regulations that we have in place that manifest themselves in the built environment. And all of our work, and you will hear this from Ben and I and the rest of our team throughout this process, our work is really rooted in those AACP policy statements, as well as the community's climate action plan and our environment stewardship policies. Those will form the basis for not only our approach to the work that we will be undertaking during the moratorium, but they will also form the backbone of the scientific and best practice rationale that we will present to you for whatever the responses are to some of the problem statements that we've identified working together over the last couple of months. As far as tonight's concerned, we hope to achieve three things: to arrive at agreement on policy analysis direction for staff for the next 4 months, for council to assist us in identifying those things which may be missing from the list included in your memo and in our presentation tonight, but which a majority of council believe ought to be included during the moratorium process specifically. And these would be things that are separate from that which you would like city staff to explore, which maybe doesn't require the moratorium process to be successful. And that's an important distinction we're going to have to make as we're having those discussions and hopefully tonight. And then finally, identification of items that should be removed from staff's proposal. If you feel as though something staff is suggesting is not aligned with your vision or your shared understanding of these problems and what might be the best paths to arriving at solutions, we need to hear about that as well. I'm going to very briefly introduce some members of the project team and also create some space, if council so chooses, to discuss other elements of the 2022 Community Development and Environmental Health Work Plan, which you feel like warrant discussion tonight as they may be relevant to the work during the moratorium. The work plan is obviously extensive. We have had previous discussions about many of the projects that are identified in that work plan. It is not our intention tonight to go into great detail about that, but it is important on an annual basis for our department to remind council of the activities of our departments, and that includes both community development and environmental health and sustainability. And if council believes that there is some nexus between those work plan items and some of the work that we've identified under the moratorium, but maybe isn't included in our work plan for the moratorium, we need to hear about that tonight. Because again, following this discussion, staff will begin in earnest to undertake the charge that you've given to us and start working on solutions. So as far as how we're staffing the moratorium project, you see here on the screen in front of you a list of primary staff members who will be working on different elements of our approach to the moratorium. So in community development, it's Mr. Anderson and myself, along with Garrett Larimer, who's our senior planner, and Haley Hart, who's our zoning enforcement officer. On the climate action side, Ashley Pearl, climate action manager, you're all familiar with her, and Tim Karfs, who's the sustainability programs administrator, who's a relatively new addition to our team that brings a robust skill set on relevant topics and subject matter in order to help us with some of that nexus between the land use work and the climate work that we hope to do. Jamie McManus will be managing community engagement with the help of a consultant team on behalf of the city. And Pete Strecker, who is, will continue to assist me and my staff specifically on our response to short-term rentals, as well as assisting with larger financial concerns or considerations as they may come up during the process. And each one of these staff members brings a very specific skill set to bear. And I hope that it is clear from the size of the team that we're putting on this project, as well as the size and the skills of the consultant team, which Ben will describe in just a moment. I hope it's clear that we are taking this process very seriously. We will move with all diligent speed and are putting the best resources available on trying to solve these problems so that we can present council with the best possible regulatory responses in response to the timeline that has been created by Ordinance 27, the timeline June 8th of the lifting of the moratorium. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ben. He can run through the consultants that we will be working with and their specific areas of expertise. And then we'll start walking through the content of the memo in tonight's presentation. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor and Council, again, thanks for your time this evening. Just to pick up where Philip left off, I think that we feel confident in the staffing, kind of internal city staffing that we're bringing to the project. And then we're bringing some of the top folks in the business on the consultant side of things to give us support on a variety of tasks associated with this project. The local office of Design Workshop is kind of leading much of our expert support for this project in data aggregation, development analyses, case studies, review of peer communities, code review. We're also serving as the lead in partnership with City Explained Inc. On public engagement. RRC and EPS are firms that we've worked with in the past. They are very skilled at thinking about economic data and the relationship of development and economic analysis. Our specifically is going to be leading employee generation study, and then they're teaming up together to give us some analysis of the short-term rental market. White and Smith, who helped us most recently on our fee and lieu study and calculation, they're providing us with support on legal sufficiency of any of the proposed code changes that we might come forward with. They're going to be doing code review, and they're also doing a lot of work in communities across the country on short-term rental policies, and they're going to be serving as an advisory just to some of the responses that we may have in the short-term rental space. Any questions about either staffing or consultant support before we move forward? Yes.
Questions about mute buttons too, amazingly still. Thank you guys. I was hoping you could give a bit more detail about City Explained, sort of their process. I checked out their website, didn't really tell me much. I'm kind of curious of their methodology or their approach to public engagement.
Be happy to jump in on that first, Ben. So City Explained is a large firm on the East Coast that provides a lot of planning consultancy services to communities in the country. Design Workshop brought them in as a sub, specifically to bring in one staff member who works for City Explained, who used to work for the city of Aspen a number of years ago. Her name is Riley Timmons. She used to be on the city planning staff, and she was on AYPA board for a number of years. She was a member of our community for quite some time. And she is IP2C certified, which is the international certification for professional community engagement, for community engagement professionals, right? She has the highest level of certification available from that organization. And she's been working in the community engagement space on planning topics for a number of years, for the bulk of her professional career. And so given her local knowledge and contacts and her professional skills, Design Workshop felt like she would be the ideal sub to support them as being the primary consultants on community engagement for this project. So it's kind of the right way to think about it is that Design Workshop is driving on community engagement, and they have subbed that out to somebody with the ideal skill set and local knowledge to support our efforts. We feel really good about that relationship.
Got it. I know Riley well, have a super high opinion of her. Everything you just said makes sense. And it strikes me that there's sort of two components to successful public outreach in this effort, which is going to be a complicated one. The first one is understanding the ecosystem, the players, who to put together, how to put them together, and when to put together. And I think you just described really clearly why Riley and this group are the right choice for that and are going to do a great job. The second piece is once they're in the room, sort of what does the facilitation look like? And that may be very different for a technical subgroup looking at a piece of code versus a broader community group on some broader topics. I recognize that, but does Riley, does that specification that you mentioned, does this company follow particular protocols. I'd like to kind of get a sense of like, if I'm a community member who wants to be involved, you know, what is that experience going to be like for me? Because I just think it's really critical for our success.
That's a good question and a hard one to answer succinctly, but I will try. So I think the community members' experience is going to depend on where they live, who they are, what they do for a living, and how they choose to plug into the process, right? We have strategies and tactics that we are developing with Design Workshop and City Explained assistance to tailor the experience, tailor the strategy and tactics to different constituencies within our community. So for example, if somebody is a city resident and a real estate industry professional, we are going to be engaging with them in, I think, two sort of specific ways. One is as a sort of general resident and community member, seeking to inform them, as well as creating space for them to inform us about their lived experience as a resident. But we also need to create space and sort of mechanisms to engage with that individual in a professional capacity. And those would be things like interviews, one-on-one interviews, or focus groups, or technical stakeholder groups where we can, in a very topical way, tap into their professional expertise as distinct from their lived experience in the community, right? So that's sort of one example. Another way to think about it is the difference between what we call engagement of the community and informing the community, right? And so people who maybe care about outcomes but aren't fluent in the topics or don't really know the best way to get there, they just have a vision for their community for the future. That individual, in our estimation, wants to be informed by the process, so they can know when there are opportunities to plug in, and they want to understand where there may be sort of threshold moments where their participation would be meaningful and where they can be heard, right? And we can inform those types of individuals about timing and the sort of best venue for those types of opportunities. And then you have somebody who maybe isn't a professional, is certainly a concerned citizen, and but wants to plug in a technical way. That requires another set of strategies and tactics that allows them to get specific with us about, in a sometimes technical way, how they think we need to be managing the built environment, and provide us with that granular information over and above being informed, over and above making some general comments at a public meeting. Some of those strategies and tactics might be neighborhood meetings, right? Where we actually go into an HOA or a subdivision and host a meeting where we're bringing information to people and creating a venue for them to feed information back to us, right? So those are just sort of three examples of how we're tailoring those strategies and tactics. And it will not be just Design Workshop and City Explained who are staffing these meetings. There'll be city staff at the vast majority of these meetings where appropriate, and sometimes it's not appropriate, where appropriate, to make sure that we have a local face on the process and to make sure that the information that's being conveyed and received is sort of, again, commensurate with community expectations and responds to people's individual needs. Does that help you understand a little bit?
Yeah, it does a lot. And I recognize that it's a multifaceted question and different instances require different processes. What I heard you say, what's that?
Stop me a second.
Oh, someone might be unmuted. What I heard you say that really resonates with me is that we will be going out to people, right? We're going to be allowing them to know when is best for them, and really to bring them in. I think that's really critical. And then I heard you talk about like community meetings and that ethos of listening and workshopping. I had dinner with Ward and Mimi last night. We were talking about just sort of generally the cultural breakdown in our politics nationally, mostly, where conflict has become only negative, right? It's just this thing where we only are there to win, to beat, and to shove other people aside, when like in functioning political cultures that are trusting, conflict is actually a great opportunity to collectively sense make, to bring our best different ideas together and emerge with something that's greater than the sum of our parts in a trusting environment. And I hear that is kind of what you are describing. And I believe, you know, our opportunity to model that in this, you know, really, really generationally important process is going to be key to us all getting to yeses at the end of this. So I'm just really happy to see that, and thank you for taking the time to dig in on some of the details. I think it's really important.
Thank you, Councilmember.
We've got another hand up from Rachel.
Yeah, thank you. It's a challenge to answer the question that Ben and Philip put out, is the team sufficient, until we later talk about, are there any missing pieces? And you can tell us if this team will be able to cover those missing pieces. Otherwise, I would say I'm very supportive of the team that you've put together, but once we get to those discussions about, you know, the kind of the hows and is anything missing there, you might find something you need to add to it. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Ben or Philip?
That's all we have. If it's okay, we'll move forward.
Yes.
In our last conversation that we had together, we identified these constraints that we think are pretty fundamental to our thinking about how to conduct the process, the outcomes that we're pursuing, the things that we might do and things that we might not do. And I think also, and I think some of this just came forward in the discussion about public engagement, kind of acknowledging the confounding nature of several of these issues, and you know, the conflicting views that we know are present on these topics within the community. We understand these things, and they're important to how we made some decisions in our proposal that we have in front of you this evening. So keep these in the back of the mind as we move forward. I particularly want to give a call out to time in that we put a 6-month deadline on this moratorium. And as we discussed in the memo, staff is working backward from that June 8th date to come forward with policy recommendations and potential code amendments for your consideration. And that is important to us, and it's shaping a lot of our thinking about how to approach this whole process. This is a graphic that was in your in the memo. It's just a graphic to kind of explain the timeline that we're operating off of. Starting tonight, with direction from council, we're going to be launching into really 2 immediate tasks. Well, I guess a third task. We do need to finalize contracts with our consultant team. We wanted to get confirmation of an action plan before we did that. But pretty immediately, there's going to be opportunities for the community to plug in. We're going to be starting our work with the consultant team on research, analysis, concept testing. Those 2 things we anticipate to kind of run parallel to each other through early to mid-April. It's at that point that council's going to start seeing some presentations from staff with proposed ordinances. Based on the work that we've conducted with the consultants and based on the feedback that we get from our community partners as they give us feedback on their ideas and our work. We have already charted out in council's long-range calendar 5 work sessions, 4 regular meetings as we get into April and May to start potential code amendment processes if we're there. I do want to give some attention to March 22nd. You folks have participated in policy resolutions previously. This kind of lands on I would say the 10,000 foot level in terms of the policy direction that might end up leading to a potential code change. And so we'll be coming back to you. Our intention is on March 22nd. Some direction on the topics that we're going to be presenting to you in just a second here, and seeing if that reflects council's view on what we should be pursuing in terms of code amendments moving forward. Any questions about this timeline? Any questions about council's intersection with this timeline?
Skippy?
Sorry. The March 22nd thing, this is all new to me. So can you explain that to me in a bit more detail? What exactly will we be reviewing? What is the process? What's the purpose of doing that then?
Yeah, anytime within the land use code, anytime we propose an amendment to the code, the first step in the process is policy resolution. It's done in a public hearing. It is a chance for staff to propose a recommended course of action. It doesn't provide details of the code amendment, but are we getting the policy right? Are we pursuing the council's in agreement with as we begin that policy resolution? And this will be kind of, you know, fairly early in the process, but far enough along that we're going to have some pretty good ideas about what we're hearing from the community. We'll have, by that point, had at least a couple of work sessions with council to talk about our progress to this point. We will have done pretty significant work with our consultant team, and we think by that time we should have a pretty good idea. Again, not of the details of the ordinances, but what are the more specific policy directions that we're pursuing as we come to the conclusion with some potential code amendments at the end of this process? That policy resolution gives direction to that. It's kind of a check-in with to see that we're on the right path, give opportunity in the public hearing for the public to comment on that. But it's really kind of in this process, it's really kind of an interim kind of formal check-in that we're on the right direction and we're continuing to pursue the things that council feels is the right path.
Okay, so just to reflect that back, you know, kind of what I'm hearing is, you know, we signed up for a senior level course in college. The policy resolution is like, we get our syllabus and we know the final paper is coming up. It has to be handed in June. And on the 22nd, we're handing in our initial outline for the teacher and our peers to review. And once we get the check off, then we're filling in the paragraphs. Is that kind of the deal?
I think that's a pretty good metaphor.
Awesome. Thank you. I understand.
Other councilman questions about timeline? All right.
We outlined these items in the memo, but further beyond those constraints, there was these kind of 5 ideas that really shaped staff's proposal that's in front of you this evening. Because of the timelines, because I think of the community's focus on this project, but really time. Time is a big issue here. We want to focus on the things that will have the most direct effect. We want to do a few things thoughtfully and effectively, as opposed to a scattershot approach that treats things superficially. We want to identify things that require the protection of the moratorium. As we do this work, we're going to be getting a whole lot of data and a whole lot of ideas about what direction we should be going on a whole lot of different things. And I think that these first 3 topics here, these first 3 ideas here, give focus to the work that we have in front of us and make sure that use of this moratorium is appropriate, that we're doing things that are going to be thoughtful and effective, and that we're doing a few things really well. And to the 4th point, that there's going to be some topics that we identify during this process that can wait, that don't need to be done before June 8th. And all of this, I think, both for staff and our consultant team, importantly for the community, importantly for council, we think that this proposed course of action that we've charted out in the memo sets some realistic expectations, ambitious expectations, but realistic. And those 5 ideas, on top of the constraints that we previously talked about, really, I think, shaped what what popped out of this process that we've been engaged in the last few weeks following our last conversation with you. All right, so as the memo outlined, we have broken down the ideas in Ordinance 27 into 4 distinct areas. Short-term rentals, pace and scale of development, promotion of affordable housing, and development review processes, the way that we review things in the land use code. So I want to go through each one of those topics separately. We're going to have some time to kind of linger and talk and see if you're supportive of what staff is proposing. Are there, again, kind of going back to the first slide that we had, are there things that we have missed, need to be including? Or are there things that we need to be taking out of this process that can be handled at a time kind of following June 8th? For each of these, again, we'd kind of like to go through them individually. The first slide, I try to get a little creative with graphics here. I feel like I give a lot of bullet points to you guys. The first slide summarizes the problem statements that we identified the last time that we met. And then there's going to be slides that talk about, kind of follow along with a memo of the kind of action steps that staff is recommending, the policy area direction staff is recommending. And we'll have a chance to have a conversation about those in a little bit of an informal way, just to see where the 5 of you are sitting on this proposal. So firstly, short-term rentals. In our problem statement discussion last time with you, there was lots of discussion around wanting to mitigate employee generation and other impacts of this land use, acknowledging short-term rentals as a distinct land use with distinct characteristics. I know that we've all had lots of conversations with community members about the impacts of short-term rentals in their neighborhood and on the community. We want to ensure basic health, safety, and visitor experience standards. And we want to discourage further displacement of working locals. That's what we talked about last time, and there seemed to be consensus around those 5 ideas on this topic. From that, this is where staff proposes our work on this topic between now and June. Primarily around the permit standards and processes that we have in the land use code. Certainly, we have some questions to answer and some questions to ask, still questions to ask, I think, related to zoning. And when we talk about zoning, this could mean the number of STR permits in a particular place, the locations that are appropriate, the densities and intensities of use in particular parts of town, and their adjacency to surrounding uses. We've had lots of conversation with council and members of the community about the desire for operational standards, days of operation across the year, occupancy, nuisances, wildlife trash, parking access issues. We don't have a lot of rules in our land use code around what makes a short-term rental a good neighbor. And we feel like there's some work that we can do in giving clarification, doing some education on those topics. Certainly there is I think an expectation that we put in place some life safety expectations on these. That could mean inspections, that could mean making sure that fire standards are being met, signage and noticing requirements are being met in the relationship to their neighborhoods. These next 2 are probably the place that are going to get, as we have a conversation with our community, a conversation that are going to be difficult. One is around permitting, the eligibility for a residence to be considered for a short-term rental permit, and the transferability of that permit from one owner to the next, or from an owner from one property to the next. Financials, there's been discussion about considering permit fees, impact fees, Other communities have instituted excise taxes. I think Frisco's in pursuit of that in a peer community. And lastly, if short-term rentals are not meeting our expectations or operating outside of the regulations that we do put in place, we need to probably up our ante on enforcement. And what that looks like, how it's staffed, what kind of fines are appropriate for different kinds of infringements of the regulations. Those are the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at as we sort of have this conversation with the community and work with our consultant support. Questions or comments about this? Anything we missed? Anything that we should add?
Rachel, go right ahead.
Can't read your lips, Rachel.
Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. I think the this section gets a little bit towards the question you asked earlier about sufficiency of how this is being framed. And the one thing I really keep coming back to, and maybe go back to that last slide, if you would, Ben, that would help me a little bit. You know, the one thing I don't see in here that I do think we've all talked about consistently, and maybe you've just broken it down into component pieces, but that is how will these line up with the Aspen Area Community Plan in terms of its many goals? You know, maybe we're thinking that zoning and looking at zoning will tell us, is it near a transportation corridor or is it 5 miles away from a transportation corridor? How will it impact transportation? But I'm still looking at short-term rentals and these other code potential changes of how do they bring our community future development and growth patterns into alignment with the community plan. And so I see that as the frame that all these things fall under. And one of those key items is capacity. You know, I think it was a 30,000 number that was identified as, you know, residents and visitors alike in this upper triangle of Aspen, Snowmass, and the Airport Business Center. But how does that relate to this? And for me, as it goes forward, there's this intersection about, we talk here, you have employee generation and mitigate employee generation, but I think they should almost be two separate things. I think to fully understand the employee generation that is potentially coming forward from this, and then the question is how to appropriately mitigate it. But I'd rather make sure we really get that mitigation number right. And a challenge I think we all are particularly looking at, given the outcome of the county's hearing on second reading of their STR program, is the potential that they may allow every residence in Pickens County to be an STR right now. They backed off on their primary residence requirement and are now looking further. And so I know I'm being obtuse here and trying to make this point here, but I'm really concerned about, you know, our ability to house the workforce that we need for our businesses with this increased demand, with the displacement, and what's happening with S2Rs literally throughout the entire valley. Not, you know, so we're losing far more workforce than just the Aspen displacement. It is what I'm seeing. And I you know, perhaps the research and the looking into this bigger picture will tell me if I'm accurate or I'm not accurate. But it concerns me when I see an ad in the Glenwood Springs paper, which I saw this weekend, for a wonderful ranch that you can rent in Woody Creek. And it has, you know, 6 bedrooms, 6 baths or whatever for $50,000 a month. And at what point does $50,000 a month short-term rental in Woody Creek draw 5 employees away from the Aspen business core? At what point is that a loss of a chef, a housekeeper, and a property manager of a hotel? how do we really understand what is coming down the pike for employee demand first before really talking about mitigation is an issue for me. And again, what are the other highlights and aspirations of the community plan that STRs under a unregulated scenario would be in conflict with? And so for me, a lot of this is really understanding almost as if we were in an environmental impact statement and there's the do nothing alternative. And I think that in terms of the services we need to fund and provide, the experience that the guest, the customer, the golden goose expects, where is there a breaking point, or is there one, or is it just we all get used to a diminished level of service? Is that what the community can expect, or what is?
Councilmember Richards, can I?
Yeah,
can
I'm
I just
sorry.
Get in because you've covered a lot of ground, and I feel like there's some things in there that we need to talk through, and I don't want to lose sight of some of the points that you've made. So do you mind if I
yeah, go right ahead there, Philip.
Thank you so much. There's two things you said that I want to make sure that we kind of get out in the air and are on the same page about here. And the most important for us is about the relationship between scope and time. And I hear you very, very clearly articulating concerns about capacity and about the regional effect of this particular use on a whole host of issues of major community concern. And we have 4 months. So it is staff's view that it would be completely unrealistic for us to undertake an analysis of something like the relationship between infrastructure capacity, which is how we conceptualize the concept of carrying capacity in community development. The relationship between infrastructure capacity and a land use at a regional scale. That is not something that we can accomplish in a 4-month period of time. And I also, from a regulatory outcomes standpoint, as far as the city of Aspen is concerned, the scope of work that Ben and I are presenting this evening is very much focused on the sort of acute nature of the problem and within our jurisdiction. And some of the sort of larger regional concerns are things that the Aspen Area Community Plan and our sort of initial work in this space will inform and be informed by. But the concept of the sort of regional approach and infrastructure capacity is not something that this process is going to permit the time to explore. And so I just want to manage some expectations around that. And the other thing that I think is going to be important for the rest of the discussion this evening is the role of existing city policy and how it relates to the proposals before you this evening. You're 100% right that the Aspen Area Community Plan is vital and central as a sort of underpinning or justification for any regulatory changes that we may attempt to make as part of this process. But we can't suggest right now what policies may be supported or achieved by regulations that we haven't really conceived of yet. And so what we're really presenting this evening is very conceptual level framework, but the details of which will need to be supported by existing city policy. So to give you a sort of concrete example, on the topic of the relationship between zoning, short-term rentals, and Aspen Area Community Plan policies, we would arrive at a place during this process where we can show that our policies around transportation, demand management, and multimodal level of service would be supported by focusing short-term rental uses in areas proximal to transit, right? So that would be the way that we can reflect back to council and the community how the Aspen Area Community Plan is supported by potential changes that we would make. Does that sort of...
Philip, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I appreciate, hopefully, you taking my comments and seeing how they could work within the filter of what you're trying to get done. But I'll tell you, just thinking about it from a big picture and from a distance, if the community does not understand the fork in the road that we are at, and where the going down the fork in various directions will take us in 10 years or 15 years, then the work is not going to be appreciated for what it is until 10 or 15 years from now. And we've either gone down the no regulation, no anything, let's see where it takes us, or a path that's different from that. And in my way of thinking, given there's already an initiative out there, and the potential of whatever we do pass going to a community referendum, I think it's important that the framing and the understanding of why we're doing what we're doing, and it is really important, beyond what I can explain well or express. But, right now, here's a short parallel example. We're seeing a lot of community demand about why isn't there more housing? Why isn't there more workforce housing? And no one's looking back to the 20 years where people fought against that housing, and they fought against the size or the density, or were not supported. And now we suddenly have a demand as if the city of Aspen was going to replicate the entire workforce 100% that we used to draw from down valley and we used to draw from in town. And it's simply not going to happen. But you could see that coming 5 years ago. You could see it coming 10 years ago. And so if we can't make it clear of where our community will be going, if it's an unregulated STR scenario, both in terms of having any employees at all, having any community character left, or anything like this left, that's got to be the fulcrum of this crossroads. And that's all I'm trying to get at. Even if we're not fully acknowledging or trying to research what's happening in the county, in the region, there has to be at least some passing acknowledgement that we're working within an environment that is potentially draining workforce from multiple other angles. From it's not just the bucket in Aspen has holes in the bottom of it. That's all I'm trying to say. Sure. Thank you.
And we had conversations previously about framing, and Ben and I heard you loud and clear about that, and particularly our outreach materials, as well as our messaging to the council starting in March, will be very much focused on framing things in the context of possible outcomes, right? So not just asking a simple question about a sort of current scenario or a threshold choice one way or another, but thinking about the community in the future and the potential outcomes of choices that we make or don't make now. And so that is sort of fundamental to how we plan on discussing this with council and the community for the next 4 months. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ward?
Yeah, thank you. I know that there are a lot of weeds that we want to get into in the next 4 months here, right after our policy resolution. But just from a very high level, I just want to make a few comments that, first of all of these 4 different areas morph into each other. And I think what we've seen, and we as a community and as a council have seen, is that it's time for government to make some intervention into the free market, because the free market is not controlling itself in a way that is complementary or in harmony with the vision that we have defined as in the Aspen Area Community Plan. And I think I hear people say, well, it's too late. And my response to that is, maybe it's too late, but if we don't try something, we're certainly going to lose. And it's really ineffable, the spirit or the fabric of Aspen. The Aspen Area Community Plan really does the best at defining what our goals are and what our aspirations are as a community. And we're left to try to discern where we are now and how is that in harmony with what we want to be. And I think of, so many words of wisdom have been said in the past. If not now, when? If not us, who? So we've bid it off, and it's our choice to try to do what we can to retain the spirit and fabric of Aspen. And again, it's like a little spiritual here. It's like God is ineffable, yet there are libraries full of books trying to explain what God is and who God is. The burning bush told Moses, I am what I am. Lao Tzu said that the Tao that you can name is not the Tao. And it's like we try to talk about what the spirit in fabric of Aspen is. We try to retain it, but it's really difficult to really put a finger on it. So all we can do as policymakers and as staff working with us is try to stop the bleeding, try to do the best we can to make the community more in line with what our goals and aspirations really expressed in the Aspen Area Community Plan are. And I don't think anybody's smarter than the free market, but we can try the best we can to stop some of the behavior, like the STR. All of these just blend in together. The whole business model of STRs drives the residential development and raises the prices, and as Rachel is saying, creates the need for housing and all of these things. Rachel says that we've got to get the mitigation right, but that's where we're really relying on our consultants to do the survey to find out what the impacts are and how we can, at least with those data points, try to mitigate and right the ship, put a rudder on it and put a keel on it and put the spinnaker up and let's go. So mixing metaphors, but I just want to say from the very get-go, as we get going here, we have a big task ahead of us, but it's a worthy project, and I think the fabric and spirit of Aspen is on the balance.
Thanks, Ward. Skippy or John, I'm going to look to you for comments on this section, short-term rentals, and the screen that's in front of you. We were on to this slide, short-term rentals as well. The question in front of you, is there anything missing or anything that you're thinking of? And while you're just thinking of that, Ben and Philip, I just want to take one very important piece out of what Rachel was talking about, and that is about the AACP as part of our guiding intention to what we're doing here. I mean, there was a lot to unpack in the multiple layers of things that she said, but she started it off with the one statement about the AACP still being at the core of some of the ideas that we're talking about here. And I just wanted to reinforce that.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Mayor, thank you for that. And I was going to respond with a couple of things to a couple of comments I've heard. One is, yeah, it's going to be kind of in our summary comments. We mentioned it a couple of times in the memo, but outside of these specific kind of policy directions, kind of central to our whole frame and the lens through which we're looking at all of this work. And I think Ordinance 27 did a great job of laying this out. I think the AACP and various policy statements that are present there. I think City of Aspen's climate goals, commitments that we've made around climate topics, again, central to this work, the lens through which we're thinking about this. And I think also council goals that have previously been stated. At your retreat this summer, you identified housing and climate action as two central goals that you're interested in focusing on this year. And we think that that's, again, the lens that most of this work is being framed through. And then secondly, I just wanted to say, I think in terms of impacts, Rachel, previous staffs and councils, just to kind of give you a sense of what we're trying to understand with this consultant work, previous councils and staff have landed on a 0.6 FTE employee generation for each lodge room that's established in the city of Aspen. We don't have that currently for short-term rentals. We have no idea about how much impact, whether it be to employee generation or whether it be to our transportation system or whether it be to our, our utilities or, kind of all the things. And Rachel, I think you've identified the concurrency of infrastructure several times in your comments with us. We don't have any idea about how short-term rentals are changing the dynamics on those kinds of things. And so I will say that our consultant team of RRC and the EPS have thought about these kinds of impacts in other mountain communities, have put together some really interesting ways to think about the way that these kind of land uses fit into the fabric of the community. And we're going to get some presentation of some data on which to think about this land use in perhaps a different way.
Thanks, Ben.
Ben, I want to make a really brief comment on this because I've thought about it a little bit. I really appreciate both you and Philip's work and digesting and regurgitating what we end up kind of having around. But it struck me that we kind of say, oh, we got 1,000 STRs, or we got 400 STRs, or we got 300 STRs, whatever it is. But we don't talk about them in terms of bedrooms. And I think that is something we need to start doing because, a lot of our homes are 6 and 8 bedroom homes. And, if we're talking about 500 2-bedroom STRs, that's 1,000 more guests maybe, or if 2 people per bedroom, that's 4,000 guests. But if we're talking about 6-bedroom STRs and there's 1,000 of them, that's a lot more people. So I just think that at some level we need to not group the same 1-bedroom short-term rental that someone's making out of their 2-bedroom apartment, getting the same an STR that's 5 bedrooms with 5 baths that's going to have 2 families in it. And I don't know quite how to do that, but it has struck me that the more we talk about them as just an STR, as opposed to how many bedrooms for guests that we're creating, we might be getting misleading numbers. Thank you.
That's really important and helpful feedback, Councilmember Richards, and something that we will incorporate into our work. And it rubs both ways, right? Council has made comments not only about impacts from short-term rentals, and understanding the relationship between bedrooms and impacts will be instructive. Council's also made comments about the degree to which certain short-term rentals support a diverse bed base and provide a more, I won't call it approachable, but a more affordable lodging product. Not necessarily affordable, but maybe approachable lodging product. And so understanding at the staff level the granularity of the relationship between bedrooms and impacts, bedrooms and lodging, and being able to bring that information back is precisely the kind of work that we will be doing for the next few months, and adding that bedrooms concept. Adding the bedroom concept is very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. That is a great point. John?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the fact that Skippy put on a little housing summit, I'll call it, at the local house. Troy was there briefly, and we talked about this. The fact that some properties seem specifically designed to be STRs. And how do we address that? I mean, that's a huge gray area. The other thing I wanted to mention was, educating the public to the fact that we want STRs to be on transportation lines, I think is a really important first step in getting the word out and educating the public on why this moratorium happened. And I'd also like to thank Philip and Ben for helping us and their staffs for helping us with this project. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Okay, let's move forward, Ben.
Oh, wait, do I get to?
Sure. I'm just looking for, yeah, your digital hand, Skippy. I can't see everybody when there's a shared screen. Go ahead, Skippy.
Sorry, I will use that. Yes, so I really appreciate this, Philip, and you know, all the problem statements are correct. I think all of the things that you have highlighted to work on are agreed to. I agree with, have merit, and are important. The one thing that came up for me, and it wasn't just in the short-term rental space, but looking across the packet, and it kind of mirrors some of Rachel's concern, is that connection to the broader picture. While we stay in the trees, are we also looking at the forest? And so the specific here that I view as absent, but would apply to these other buckets is when we're looking at our residential zone district, right, the meta problem is they're becoming non-residential. And the goal is to make them more residential, not just to stop the bleeding by, you know, inhibiting those things that have been converting away from residential to vacancy or STR, but doing physical training so that when redevelopment happens, we actually get more residential, right? That's really the holy grail. And when we complete this at the end of the day, one of the big wins for our community and one of the big messages that we'll get to send is the collection of these land use policies that we don't have to explain because they're complicated, we believe over the next decade are going to deliver a significant amount more housing in our residential zone districts, right? And so with that frame, I wonder where that bigger equation comes in, right? Because the way I think about it, right, there is sort of the land use code is a math equation. And right now, the collection of those variables, the X's and the Y's, are coming to the conclusion that is 7-bedroom spec home rented as STR or vacant, right? And we're looking to reorient each of those variables to come to another conclusion. So when I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but when we look at allowable FAR for free market residential, there's an opportunity to reduce that, which is part of that equation. When it comes to 100% affordable properties, there's an opportunity to increase the allowable to make that more beneficial. When it comes to short-term rental, if we limit or make not sure or reduce the ability to get a short-term rental permit, then it lowers the output of the thing that we don't want. And so we move down the chain, and maybe there's some city sweetener. I mean, we've talked about all this, right? We understand this. There's GMQS, there's credits, but I don't see in this document the point that says, as we're doing all of these important micro things that are necessary, that we're doing it within the framework of understanding of that larger equation to actually yield the thing that we want. And I know we've talked about it, we've agreed to it, maybe it's in our heads, but that's the one thing that I didn't see on the page that I just wanted to bring attention to.
You're correct. It's not on the page, and that's intentional. Again, I'll sort of reiterate what I said previously about the relationship between time and capacity and successful outcome. That's clear in the memo, and I sort of mentioned that to Rachel previously. And I would add to that, I appreciate the metaphor of the forest and the trees, and I feel like what we are doing for the next 4 months, and I hope we're describing this properly in our documentation, is identifying a section of forest, identifying specific trees, which require the protection of a moratorium in order to address, right? And the outcome that you're describing has a lot of component parts to it that do not require a moratorium to effectively address.
Yeah.
I look at the contents of Council's housing strategic plan, which Assistant City Attorney Foster has so skillfully put together over the last month and a half. And there are a lot of the components of that plan which would lead council and the community towards the outcome that you're describing. And there are so many levers to pull in the land use code over time in pursuit of that outcome that to try and to do that all at once in a holistic process would be in my, to sort of mix metaphors, trying to bring in the white whale, right? And I don't think that we would necessarily be successful in doing that. And we certainly don't have the time allotted at this point to do that. And so again, what you're seeing in this package is staff's estimation of what is responsive to the timeline, responsive to council, community, and staff capacity, and requires a moratorium to successfully execute in our development context.
Yeah. So understood all of that. Read it in the packet and understand and agree with the premise, right? We can't do everything. We can't do the impossible. I also, I don't want to leave this meeting disappointed, right? I want to leave this meeting feeling empowered, possible, and bring that out into the community. And I want our community to feel that way as well. So perhaps you can, use me as the stand-in for that. There's an opportunity to work on the, as you said, acute things while still focusing on the end goal. I think one great example that you gave that really landed for me with Rachel's example is, yeah, we're not going to solve the whole picture of the STR landscape in the valley, but we can use a tool now to make sure that STRs are concentrated around transportation hubs. And that clearly moves us in that direction. Like that landed for me, that was super clear. And so I think the opportunity here is to get more clear with the community around these things because, the vast majority of the community is not going to understand. Like this is confusing more than anything because it's just so much. But that big picture of where we're going and how these relate to that, I believe is where we can really rally and involve the community. And so, yeah, I guess I would just ask us to strive to draw out perhaps more of those examples. And Rachel, I see your hand up. Do you want to jump in, or I had just kind of one more thing to add?
You're done, Skippy.
Okay. So I have implicit trust in you, Philip, and with the entire department of staff. I think you guys are tremendous. And I know we are driving at the same thing. And it's also the case that there are moments to focus on the acute issue, right? So, if I'm out running and I get a sharp pain in my knee, it may make sense to stop and stretch that for a while first. There's other times where I'm out running and I'm in a marathon and I'm looking for a time and I get that same pain in my knee. And I've run a marathon before. So I know that even though it might be wise to focus on that thing, what I actually need to do is keep running, and it's going to go away in 2 months, right? Or in 2 miles rather. And so I think there is that tension, which is complicated, of painting the picture and really working things towards that long-term goal, recognizing that much of that work will come after, but being able to tell the community, well, we're running a marathon and we know that this is going to get us there, and here's how this little piece is going to end up there. That may be more confusing than helpful.
Skip, if I may respond a little bit to that. I do think, I think Philip's right, and I support his larger perspective, but I will say pretty clearly that I think whether it's on short-term rentals or these other 3 topic areas that we've kind of identified, if we can be successful in pursuing this stuff, we are going to be making immediate impact on the ideas that you just described as broad outcomes that you're pursuing. And I think that, whether it's in the short-term rental space or whether it's the things that we're kind of, proposing to be working on around promotion of affordable housing, like the intersection of those things starts to get at I think some things that you've said previously, where we want this to be happening organically in the community, that when we look back 3 years from now, like the situation's better, not because we took direct action, every 2 months to respond to this, but that we put a system in place that starts to generate some of these outcomes that you're supporting. And I think that as we envision some of the potential outcomes from some of these policy areas, like those are going to be realized if we're successful in the next few months.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't have anything I feel that's contradicting Skippy in any way. And I had really thought of mentioning this later on in the meeting after reading the memo. It seemed like there was a more appropriate place, but I do want to put it out there. I think that you guys have very wisely tried to focus and narrow what we can get done with the time and resources available, and also literally any community's ability to understand, digest, and accept change. But what I wanted to add on, of course, is that we have allocated, we have an upcoming work session on our community outreach with the community, the greater community, about the entrance to Aspen. And that's pretty significant work as well. And whether we really had looped in the rest of the ComDev work plan when we passed it in the fall, I don't know. And so I think that may well be some components of community planning, ComDev, that are dedicating some time there as well as that goes forward. And so, again, I'm just trying to say, when I looked at what the workload already was before the moratorium and before we decided we needed to address the entrance at some level or some communication, and maybe the public responds and we start moving that forward, maybe we don't, but there's always this intersectionality between multiple goals. And we have the goal of the lumberyard, and the lumberyard, if anything, from letters we're already starting to see, is getting gigged a little by not having solved the transportation entrance. And so I'm just roundabout way saying that ComDev has really got a full plate this year. I appreciate and understand that we have to do what's manageable. And I will repeat the same comment I've made before, but if it turns out that because of the outreach on other items and other things that such as the entrance, you guys need additional backup support, let us know, because we know we've loaded a lot on. Thank you.
Understood, Councilmember Richards, and that's been made clear in the past as well. And I work closely with the city manager's office to make sure that we have sufficient resources, and we're having ongoing conversations about that right now. And if additional staff or financial resources are needed, then that request would come from myself and the manager's office, and it's the typical budget process to get there. But we're absolutely cognizant of that, and we appreciate your support for the work we do.
All right, Ben, back to you. This is item 1 of 4.
Yeah. Before we leave off the slide, just in terms of the specifics, I think there's been some great comments that have been really helpful to us. But I just wanted to make sure that on any of these specific items on this slide, that there was any direction or any concern about the specifics here. Then we'll move on. This one's a little bit more complicated. It touches in growth management and some of the trickier, kind of more technical places in the land use code. We've titled this the pace and scale of development. We've had conversations with City Council about our allotment systems within GMQS over the last 18 months or 2 years. And then leading up to, at the housing retreat and several other work sessions that we've held with council, some of these ideas have come forward and certainly were identified in Ordinance 27. We're concerned about, particularly in the residential sector, again, going, similarly to STRs, really making sure that we understand the current kind of employee generation and other impacts of what's going on in our residential sector. What the heck happened on this slide? This didn't
It
go.
looks like the STR slide.
This is the STR slide with the boxes. Apologies. Let me get down to, that's strange. So, I think that we are, I had this, I must not have said it correctly. Apologies. So on pace and scale of development, I think that we're, we've talked about this previously on January 11th with you. I think that we want to make sure that we're mitigating correctly. I think that we want to make sure that the development process is not I'm trying to find the right word here, is not encouraging things within the community that we don't want to be encouraging. And I think we've got clear ideas in the AACP. We've got clear ideas in Aspen's climate action plan. And I think that, sometimes we have a land use code that encourages those kinds of things and discourages things that maybe we might be more interested in. And so I think in terms of the problem statements here, we've identified the allotment system, we've identified demolition, we've identified a mass and scale that is happening in our neighborhoods that I think is sometimes confronting to our understandings of values that are expressed in the AACP. On that last topic, I think as we've talked about this issue, there's been discussion about kind of limiting kind of mass and scale. There's been discussion about mitigating for the impacts of that, whether it be to employee generation or to energy use. And I think as we think about this pace and scale of development, it's this general idea that we have a residential sector and the kind of current development context that is not representing the way that we understand things are intended to be by the values that we've stated in the AACP and elsewhere. And so with that, we have kind of identified these areas within the pace and scale of residential redevelopment and development, primarily around development allotments. We want to kind of use our current system to rethink how we manage development, how we mitigate environmental impacts, how we support concurrency of infrastructure, how we address unmanaged development types and STRs, and how we address residential energy and resource consumption. And so we think that we can do some of that work in rethinking the way that our longstanding allotment system has guided development and growth over time. And so thoughts about this? Does this kind of reflect council's thinking about this topic? Is this
I just want to add briefly before any council comments that of the four topics, this area has the most potential to impact most directly some of council's problem statements that they've identified over the last couple of months. And our existing growth management system is an incredible opportunity to use an existing framework and adapt it to 21st century needs and 21st century development patterns and some 21st century problems as council has conceived of them. And so we are excited about this nexus between pace and scale of development, environmental and infrastructure concerns, and people's experience in our built environment. And we believe we have, again, a framework in place with the existing growth management system to make some meaningful changes. Thank you.
Rachel?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm in agreement with the items that you have addressed here to look at. And just to amplify a little on, because I think when you're talking about concurrency of infrastructure, we are talking about affordable housing as well as other components. But now that we have the home trek system in APCHA and are able to more accurately track occupancy, I have thought it's a really great opportunity to look at the allotment, the credit that's given, say, for a studio. Because we often say a studio as, like, I can't remember if it's 1.5 persons or 1.75 or something, but we can see now how many people actually usually do occupy a studio. And my thought has been that if it's really 1.75 and we're giving that developer credit for housing 1 3/4 person, are the sizes of our studios really appropriate for the fact that they're really housing 2 people, the required size? But, I think it's a chance to really take a look at, are we giving credit for employees that aren't getting housed because our numbers are too generous? How many people really live in a 2-bedroom? How many people really live in a 1-bedroom? I think that this is a really good opportunity, and I'm just going back to the term you used, mitigating properly. And so this is a much older component of our system, but it probably needs to be looked at and updated as well. Thank you.
Yeah. I will just say, Councilmember Richards, and in response to that, I think one of the things you're going to be seeing out of the Housing Strategic Plan is some improved coordination between APSHA and the land use code to kind of support these ideas. And so I will just say that I think that that's a topic that is certainly germane to all of this, certainly foundational, and I think might be happening outside of the moratorium as we work to make sure there aren't any obstacles that, you know, the kind of intersection of APSHA's guidelines and the land use code is producing.
Thanks, Ben. Skippy and then Ward. Skippy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of briefly piggyback on that, Rachel. I think it makes a ton of sense. I mean, to have the same level of understanding of our residential free market stock as our affordable housing puts us on an even playing field for action. And, you know, people are understandably upset and drawing attention to underutilization of several hundred bedrooms in our affordable housing stock. But we don't have the number to say that there are 8,000 unused bedrooms in our free market housing stock, right? And so, you know, I guess I'm just drawing attention to that off of your end. I don't know exactly how and where it fits in, but when reading this whole plan, you know, 77 pages, the number one thing that is keeping our residential zone districts from being residential is vacancy. 68%. We're on the way to 100, and the word is not mentioned once in the entire document. So I think we really need to think clearly about, you know, how we're presenting the problem statement, just to incorporate that in, even if we're not going to. I'm aware that none of these things are going to directly solve for that, so I understand why it's not there, and it's not a criticism. But we need to be clear about what the problems are and the tools we're bringing to bear. So I don't need a response. I just think that needs to be better integrated.
I think that's a really good point to make, Councilmember Mesereau, and what I'm hearing from that comment and your previous comment is as much about framing for the community and sort of narrative development as it is about any sort of potential regulatory response, particularly regulatory response under the moratorium. And again, we're thinking very, very critically about focusing much of the content of our outreach materials to the public about outcomes, being outcome focused. And I think that's going to give us at the staff level an opportunity to craft some of that narrative that you're describing about the type of community people want to live in, as opposed to being focused on sort of micro problem, not really micro problem, but an immediate problem and a specified solution, as opposed to giving people the space to conceptualize the type of community that they want to live in 5 years or 50 years. And I hear that in your comments, and we are very cognizant of that, and we'll diligently craft narratives that are focused on that. Thank you.
Well, I think that's right, Philip. And just to like offer it for your consideration, it's not about crafting a narrative. It's about just clearly and honestly communicating what's actually happening and what our intent is, and then working with the community to create a set of policies that bring about a different and better future that we can all get behind.
Ward, and then John. Ward?
Yeah, I think this is really important that we try to manage development. I think the GMQS system has been too generous. It seems every year we have carryovers, and every year we say, no, we're not going to carry over those allotments. But to me, it seems like the GMQS allotment is too high. It doesn't really curb construction. One of the things that we're trying to do is curb the impact that residential development has on neighborhoods, and really the STRs are really driving the residential development. So yeah, we need to take a really close look at GNQS, and I appreciate you bringing this to our consciousness.
John?
Yeah, just a couple random comments. I've had several heated conversations with people about this STR issue. Indeed, some family members who claimed they were ideal STR renters and they weren't an issue. And I had explained to them, it's not about you, it's about the community. The other thing I wanted to mention was I feel really confident in our staff in addressing these issues. I've known Ben and Philip since before I was on council, and I know they are interested in preserving our livability of our community. I feel good about the direction we're going in. I want to thank my fellow council members for having the fortitude to address this issue and not waver like we've seen other boards around us do. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Ben, back to you.
Yeah. Again, before we move on, any last comments on the specifics on this slide?
No.
Within this pace and scale of development, residential redevelopment conversation, we do think that it's important to focus on demolition. And as we've talked with council previously, we don't have a lot of vacant land in this town. We're not doing new subdivisions. We're not, doing expansive greenfield development as we see in other parts of the country. The development pressure that we see is about the kind of redevelopment of our residential neighborhoods, and that those kinds of pressures, those kinds of impacts that we're seeing take on all different kinds of forms. But this, in staff's view, is something that is really fundamental to starting to give some guardrails to the kinds of residential development that seems to be dominating both our real estate and development context right now. And so we need to do some work around what triggers demolition and how those triggers impact compliance with GNQS standards. We know that when someone tears down a house that still has life left in it, that there are environmental and community impacts to that. One of the things, and this gets into the weeds a little bit, but one of the things that we have difficulty administering as staff is when we have a house that's non-conforming, whether it be in floor area or height or setbacks or whatever, and someone goes to redevelop that property, it creates some complexities and concerns that we need to address. And lastly, we want to make sure that when demolition does occur, that it's delivering quality design outcomes to the community. And so there's a lot of work. This is going to be some fairly technical work. We're looking to other communities for examples of this and how they deal with this issue. This is not something that Aspen deals with by ourselves, but certainly the scale of what's happening here is maybe a little different than other places. But this is central to this pace and scale of development conversation, and we feel that there needs to be some focus here.
And in addition to that, I just want to highlight for council, because again, this is getting fairly technical, bordering on sort of inside baseball when it comes to the development situation in our community. Demolition presently is a trigger for compliance with a higher level. It's a trigger for compliance with more regulations in the land use code, in both the residential and the commercial side. If you trigger demolition, you're on the hook for a higher level of scrutiny and regulatory compliance than if you don't. And so changing the standards for how we calculate demolition, which sounds sort of fairly straightforward, has the potential to have far-reaching implications for development in the community, which is precisely why staff has identified this as an important tool. And it is likely to be, from a technical stakeholder standpoint, architects, contractors, as well as property owners, a point of some contention, some misalignment between people's perceptions of how best to go about potentially changing these regulations. And so I just want to tee up ahead of time that while this may seem straightforward, this has the potential to be one of the most impactful changes that council could make in terms of the types of development activities that we see in our neighborhoods, the scale of those development activities that we see in those neighborhoods, and the expectations that we have from different projects for mitigating their impacts, for employment, for solid waste diversion, for employee generation, for utility service upgrades, things like that. There's a lot here, and I just want to thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Skippy, Ward, and then Rachel. Skippy, go right ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you going there, Philip, because that was kind of my question. Is like mitigating environmental impact could mean so many things. You know, does this include deconstruction, reuse, recycling, or is this just a fee, right? You know, I think that the former three are the big hitters and what I'm hoping that we'll dig into. So is that where your head's at here, or help me understand to what degree, you know, this term that can mean a lot of things is?
So again, using the cover of the moratorium, whether it's necessary or not, and the time allotted as our sort of two standards for judging where we need to go on this particular aspect of the project. The things like construction and demolition waste diversion, that's important work. That not only aligns with council's climate action and solid waste management objectives, it also aligns with the pace and scale of development in the community. So in that way, it has potential to be very impactful. But in our estimation, the environmental work can happen without the cover of the moratorium. We can continue that work past the June 8th deadline. And my guess is we're going to end up with a lot of feedback from council and the community that would be translated into really good ideas, many of which can be sort of put in the parking lot, right, and considered on a longer timeline. Now, when we're talking about pace and scale of residential development as it relates to demolition, then we start talking about floor area and money in the residential sector. Those are the things that in staff's estimation benefit for council and the community, benefit from the pause in development activities so that we can put those new regulations in place and sort of hit reset with residential redevelopment activities. And so that's how we're thinking about that environmental track versus the sort of development track, if you will. Ben, did I describe that okay?
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that I do think that, Skippy, to your point, I think that, yes, it's scale and pace of development. Yes, there's some things that we need to do under the cover of the moratorium if we want to do them. But I do think that, you know, if we, as we're conceiving of this, you know, if you want to do this in the community, there are some standards that you're going to have to abide by. And I think that applying those standards or conditions of doing this kind of work are something that I think we're going to be sort of asking council in the community if there's support for that kind of thing. Because we do think that, you know, obviously there's going to be a demand for redevelopment and sometimes demolition. And we want to make sure that when that happens, that it's meeting the outcomes that we've set forward in the ASCP and our climate goals. And so I think there's a bunch of different ways that are possibilities in responding to that. But, you know, I think that if you're going to do this kind of thing, we need to put some better rules to get the outcomes that we want to get out of this kind of development activity.
Thank you, guys. Ward?
Yeah, in my notes for this evening, I had a question whether this is something, the demolition is something that needs the cover of the moratorium. I understand the nexus and the importance of it in the landfill larger, I had made notes about large demolition fees, space to sort, partial refund for fees with decreased landfill usage. But I'm not sure I'm clear if Philip and Ben and Skippy and the rest of the council are feeling that this is something that needs to be done under the cover of the moratorium, or if this can continue without at a lower threshold of importance or timeline. And I understand how it can control residential development, but I'm just curious where everybody is, if this is something that should be on top tier during the moratorium, or if it can continue and have some of the zoning and other credit programs, some of the other things take precedent in the moratorium, during the moratorium. So it's a question.
Thanks, Ward. And we'll start off with Rachel and then John.
Yeah, thank you, Ward, for raising that in that way. And I guess I was understanding the slide a little differently and what Ben and Philip had said. I got that doing the first item, triggering compliance with GMQS standards, is critically important to moving forward what we would like to do with mitigation and those standards, and then also perhaps restraining or eliminating the nonconformities, such as rebuilding as something designed just to be an STR in the wrong location. But that something like the mitigating environmental and community impacts, which I understand more to be the construction noise during the demolition and the reconstruction and traffic and the actual construction site, let alone the landfill. Those are separate. Those can be done outside and over a longer period of time, and as the right sorting facilities are created at the landfill or so on. But in order to actually have the appropriate mitigation for the employment demand that's created when one structure is torn down and a new structure is put up, the only time you're going to get any mitigation in the residential sector of existing structures is that time of triggered demolition. So I see that component as being critically important to move forward, but not all the elements of updated demolition code have to be done in the next 4 months. But for me, redevelopment is the game changer. We have an awful lot of residential restructures from the past before any mitigation whatsoever was required. And if they are allowed to demolish and keep credit for 100% of unmitigated structure going forward, I think that would doom any hope of balancing housing within the community with the free market. So that's kind of how I look at it. It's just like, yes, demolition has to be part of this, but not all the components and elements of demolition. And the thing that I was going to say, I think it's really important to look at what we call demolition. And I think the code has been cleaned up a bit over time. But when it's like, hey, we left one wall standing, it wasn't demolition, can't be the standard. And I would think it should have more to do with the gutting and the rebuilding of the interior components. The outside walls are somewhat meaningless to me, but when somebody's taken out all the plumbing and that's different. That's a demolition. If you have to demolish all these other infrastructure components of a house to make a new house, and you can say, but I've left 2 of the old walls up, that's still a demolition. And so that's where I'd like to see the code really cleaned up in those areas. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel. John?
Yeah. I just wanted to applaud Philip and Ben's efforts on trying to tighten up the code to save the structures that are worth saving, that makes sense to save, and letting the energy inefficient structures go. I know we're in good hands with our staff's direction. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'll use this opportunity to comment the same. I appreciate Ben and Philip's utilization and putting this into the work scope here. So I'm going to support it moving forward as well. And just on my own thinking here, you know, this is one of the items that actually was a reason for me to support the emergency nature of the moratorium, is because this is, if this kind of conversation goes on, what we've seen is that people would identify properties that might have undergone change, and they would just be coming in with demolition permits just on the unknown. So this is exactly one of those issues that I think gives a lot of credence to the reason that this is an emergency, because of kind of the impacts that we see in the and some of the predatory nature of spec building that we see. So I am in support of moving forward this as Ben and Philip see fit.
Councilmember Howenstein, just in response, and I think on top of some of the things that your fellow council members have said, I do think that it, you know, Philip and I spend a big chunk of our life looking at the land use code and thinking about the impacts of how the sections in the land use code work together. And one of the things that's been a big learning, a piece of my learning since I've been with the city of Aspen, because it's just not as big of an issue in other communities, that over time, this has been a big topic. And whether we're talking about commercial or residential development, the triggering of demolition and what that means and how it's measured just sends so many things into play when you cross the threshold that we currently identify as demolition. And so you know, just to kind of support some of the things that the other council members have said, and the reason why staff included it, just to give a little bit more kind of explanation to it, is that just the way that our land use code is structured and the intersection of different code sections, demolition is a thread that goes across a lot of the code sections, from definitions at the very beginning of the chapter to the zone district standards at the end. And so it's one of the reasons we felt strongly about including it.
Come back to Skippy.
I don't have much to add. I just wanted to respond because Ward asked the question. So Ward, I think staff has a really good handle on a really big and complicated thing. My default is to defer to them unless a strong case is made otherwise. I agree, demolition is a huge part of this. If the trend is away from lived-in community, that only happens when it doesn't only happen. It primarily happens, or it most conclusively happens when we demolish something and rebuild something different. And every time we do that, it just crushes our environmental goals. So I see really good reason to keep this in. But if you have a counter argument, I'd love to hear it and work through it openly. But as far as I understand it right now, I'm very supportive of this.
Can I respond to that, please? I understand all of these triggers elsewhere in this document and other documents. I wanted a certain percentage of demolition that certain standards should be triggered, such as energy usage and other things. So, but I think what I was trying to get at is some of the finer points of the demolition, about spaces for and sorting and fees, that I didn't think that was time critical. But how, and Tori, your comments about how some people would just be coming in and getting demolition permits, I think those are points that enlighten me a bit. So I appreciate that, and I think that how all of these interplay with construction and development. I appreciate that, and thanks for allowing me to suss that out a bit.
Thank you, Ward. John, another hand up? You're muted. You're still muted. Thank you.
Anytime we can preserve something that's already been built, it saves, everything: space in the landfill, energy, time, traffic, all those things. So I applaud Ben and Philip's efforts to tighten up the code so that we can reuse what's already built as much as we can. That's an important first step, and I don't know. I really like the direction that we're going here. Thanks to everyone who's making this possible.
Thanks, Sean.
If I may, for just a moment, kind of stitch a few threads together that I'm hearing from council. In addition to moratorium work, you will hear from environmental health staff about solid waste planning in the coming months. You will hear from the climate action staff about a revised climate action plan, as well as building in the queue. You will hear from the building department staff about adopting an updated building code. And those are just 3 examples in this calendar year of places for us to house good ideas that come out of the discussion around demolition and the land use code, but that are environmentally focused or structurally focused and do not require the moratorium to sort of complete the work, right? So it's my view that this particular topic is going to bear a lot of fruit for us in our work in the coming 11 months of this work plan year in a number of different ways and in support of council's environmental goal. So I'm excited about that. Thank you.
Rachel.
I'm a little unclear on what you were just saying, Philip. I do understand, again, and accept and support that a lot of this work will continue through the course of the year along with other updates. But were you saying that I'm sorry, we've switched slides now, but are you saying that triggering compliance with GMQS standards is something that would be put off as well?
I'm not. No, I was making reference to some of the discussion around embodied energy in buildings and construction and demolition waste diversion and our construction impact mitigation programs that lives in the engineering department, things like that.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Ben?
Also, kind of lastly, in the pace and scale of residential redevelopment, few of you have raised very clear concerns about residential development allowances and looking at the kind of current development context and some of the structures that are being built. And there are lots of ways in the land use code that have been put in place over time that establish essentially mass and scale of buildings, how those buildings relate to the street, how those buildings present themselves to pedestrians, how those buildings relate to their neighbors, all kinds of things in that vein. And we're going to be looking at several of those areas in the land use code, giving thought to residential development allowances, looking at the methodology for how we calculate mass and scale metrics, the relationship of those calculations for calculating affordable housing mitigation. And this is the topic that we previously brought an ordinance in front of council, Ordinance 24, that is currently on table, and we'll be revisiting those topics. But it's this kind of intersection of our zone district standards and calculations and measures, and the best way to most affect, some of the concerns that have been raised around mass and scale, community character, and very much so the impacts of these kinds of homes on our climate action goals and our climate commitments that we've made. So again, some technical areas in the land use code that we think could have some fairly significant effects both on community character issues and also on our climate action goals.
Skippy?
Yes, thank you. In agreement with all of this, I think this is super meaty and important. And I think, you know, in reading through the packet and the slide, I think there is an opportunity for us to be even clearer about our intention with the community. And I'll give you an example. In the packet, it says, you know, analyze residential development allowances and the methods for calculating building mass and scale metrics to assess alignment with community character. There's no question that's accurate, that is what we are doing. It is also true that we would not be in this moratorium if we were not already convinced that we are out of alignment with community character. So our intention is to change it, right? And we've been clear, and you know, Ward's been really strong on this, as have others, that we think the mass and scale of residential development has gotten too big, that it's out of character and it needs to be changed. And I know that there has been and continues to be a understandable concern that putting too fine a point on that communication could invite pushback. But I don't think that's the way to look at it, right? I don't think of it as pushback. I think it as you know, community fact finding and sense making. And I think it's really to our benefit to get our intentions out as clear as possible immediately, because as referenced, the last thing we want is to have this be at all unclear, murky, or clouded, and do all this work and have our head set on what we want to achieve, and then all the pushback arrives last minute, and we don't get any of it done, right? We do not want, that is the worst outcome. What we'd like to do, I think, is communicate really clearly and authentically and honestly with our community about the problem and what we intend. And if that invites differing opinion, that's great, right? That's when we're like, great, come into the circle. This is what the moratorium is about. Let's talk about it. But then you set us as decision makers up for, once we get to 4 months from now, we've known what's there for a long time. We've worked through that, we've built resolve, and we're ready for success. So I think there's that opportunity. And this was the clearest place to point it out. But throughout the document, I think we can continue to get super clear.
Thanks, Skippy. Ward, and then John.
Yeah, thank you. Ben, thank you for mentioning Ordinance 24. I think that is much more in line with what I felt we should bring the zoning into line with, and mass and scale, some of the changes that we made for what were exempted, I think should inform us on where we go with residential development, mass and scale, and floor area ratio. And I'm looking back at page 12 of our document. These are where some of this demolition and allotments that I made notes on, is that the demolition is at a certain point that energy and greenhouse gas standards should be applied, and that it's an opportune time for building IQ and benchmarking, and at a certain point in size of a building that it should be net zero energy. But in somewhat in response to Skippy's point about putting a fine point on and defining that early, I think we can do all of that, Skippy, after the policy resolution and the time frame that was presented for community outreach and input. That we should listen to what the community says, get a community response, and we can put those fine points on in that time frame. I think that was in the orange after the where we get to actually writing the code changes. So not getting too far ahead of ourselves and putting the fine point, but again, that I agree with you, Skippy, that we have to make some definite changes. And as Ben said, Ordinance 24 can be a guidepost for me on that.
Yeah, I think that's right, Ward. And you know, what I'm hearing from you is we don't want to set concrete solutions that are implacable, which is true, right? That's why we're doing outreach. And so when I say that we should be really extra clear on our intention, it's not to lock us into that in a, this is it. Rather, it's to invite the conversation. So another example is methodology for calculating affordable housing mitigation. Well, yes, we're going to be doing that, but we all already said we want to raise the affordable housing mitigation in the residential sector, right? And so if we say raise the affordable housing mitigation in the sector, we're going to get a lot more people into that conversation to help us work through what the final policy will be.
Tori, do you mind if I jump in here just briefly?
Right ahead.
Councilmember Mesereau, from a sort of tactical standpoint, I completely understand what you are suggesting. And you used a term a couple of work sessions ago. You made reference to a dispassionate investor, right? Or something like that. Mm-hmm. Well, we are dispassionate regulators, right? We're dispassionate planners insofar as we rely on process and methodology and best practice to support council's work to arrive at the regulations that are going to deliver on your policy objectives. And so in that way, we are sort of operating in a different space than elected officials operate. And so to use your example of affordable housing mitigation, council may have the policy objective of raising affordable housing mitigation in the residential sector. Staff's objective is to conduct a generation and mitigation study, which is legally defensible, which provides council with the information that they need to use staff to develop the regulations that support your policy objectives. And so, and I don't know that there's majority support for, to use your first example, being more straightforward about what potential changes to zoning standards could mean, because we haven't asked the explicit question of the policymakers. And so and there was a statement in the memo about this, and I'll just reiterate it now. It is essential for the planning staff to move through this process in a sort of transparent and linear way. And that doesn't preclude us from asking questions, to your point, that generate the feedback we need to help you make decisions. We completely hear that, and we have every intention of doing that. But we can't get to dessert before we have our dinner. And that's a crude sort of analogy, but that's how we're approaching this. Thank you.
Understood. And so that computes for me in one side and leaves something maybe unresolved on the other side. On the side of computes is, yeah, you've got to do these studies and you're approaching it from a dispassionate position, and your goal is to follow the math and the law. That makes crystal clear sense. The other part of setting us up for success, which is what you said, in addition to the math, is the community piece, right? And what I've observed so often in public process, not just ours, but others, is there's sort of vagary at the beginning that permits the community to be unaware until the final meeting. And that doesn't set us up for success either, right? And so the opportunity to bring people in early, to stress test, to collectively sense make, does set us up for success. And so I think, the opportunity to sort of level up what's been done before is to be able to hold those things in concert. And perhaps there's that division, right? Within ComDev and sort of that deeper legal work, you're following that traditional tried and true effective method, but Riley and her team can lean into that other, right? I don't know exactly how that comes together, and I don't want to over prescribe that. But if the goal is to set us up for success, then having those conversations earlier to bring people in now or in a month rather than on the final day is how we're going to do that.
Understood, and I believe that our outreach strategies will be responsive to what you're suggesting. I appreciate you.
Thank you, brother.
Ben?
Okay. Any other comments on this slide? Okay, moving on. These next two are shorter, but equally as important. We have talked extensively with council at retreat this summer, at the housing specific retreat. in December, several work sessions, we've identified some places in our land use code that I think have the kind of perverse effect of discouraging affordable housing, this thing that we most want, while encouraging other things that maybe we don't want. And so, in this situation, under this kind of policy area, we want to address these problem statements that we've already identified. That the land use code can be a barrier to predictable affordable housing development. We've talked extensively about trying to find additional incentives to bring the private sector in, perhaps through the credits program, further enhancements of the credits program. And then this last piece, I think we've talked about in a variety of different ways, but do we want to continue a system of affordable housing development that relies on more development? And I think there's been fairly clear statements from council that we want to think about perhaps some alternatives to that.
Good, yeah.
And so in this policy area, we do think that the credits program has some opportunity for some additional targeting, supporting project financing. Just to kind of explain this a little bit further, we know that the credits that we issue on projects aren't necessarily recognized by banks as a revenue stream into the pro forma of a project. Are there things that we could do to kind of help support that and give a little bit more guarantee to the value of those credits? Can we get more private sector interest in pursuing the credits program? We, have a lot of projects that are kind of in the works. People are thinking about it. People are trying to make projects pencil out right now, and they haven't necessarily pulled the strings on pursuing a land use application or going towards a building permit. And so, how do we tweak that program to kind of increase program utilization in pursuit of a credits project, and ultimately with the goal of realizing more units from the program over time? We've had some success with the program. We think there's some things that we could do to kind of enhance the program further. So the first prong on this is looking at the credits program. The second piece is the generation and mitigation study in our residential sector. We do think that, again, the allotment system where most of our significant affordable housing mitigation requirements come from is not really being utilized right now. And our allotment system and the way that we generate affordable housing mitigation for the development activity that is currently happening, which is primarily, again, residential development and redevelopment, not being captured. This is most specifically the topic of Ordinance 24 that's been previously discussed. But we think that generation and mitigation study continues to be a really important piece of generating both the kind of impetus to generate some credits projects in the private sector, because there's an acknowledgement that there's more demand for FTEs out in the system, and then also whether it's fee in lieu or whether it's extinguished credits. Bringing more units into the system, we think is a really important outcome of this generation mitigation study. So those are the first two things, and we've got one more on the next slide. But before we move on to that, I wanted to just get your views on these two items.
Start with Rachel.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much. There's one thing I'd like to kind of put out there for us as we're starting to think about this. And that is existing shortfall on one hand and new demand on the other. And so something like the credits program improvement, which I really support this going forward, that's about handling new demand. These are mostly credits bought by developers who need to mitigate a project as it is. But this doesn't do anything for the shortfall, the existing shortfall we've all had. So I just kind of wanted to start that as a premise to my comments. Again, I do support this fully. I would go back to my earlier comment about let's start getting some real accuracy in terms of what credit we're allocating for a studio, what credit are we allocating for a one bedroom? Because if we're giving a lot of 1.5 FTE credits for units that are really only housing one person, we're helping create shortfall within the new demand. And I don't want to see that happen. So getting some accuracy of the actual employees who will be housed by the various units created, that should end up helping the pro forma of those building the projects, because the developers may need more credits to satisfy the workforce demand they're creating. So let's kind of really keep the components of the program together. We have developers who need to have units. We have the employees who want the units, and then we are somewhere in the middle with our code. So that it is an important component of this, but it is based on a development model. It's based on new development going forward and leaving some shortfall to be caught up, and we already have existing shortfall. And so, I'm going to put it out there as you ask the question. I do think we are going to need both models. I do not think we're going to be able to get away from the development model of new housing if we're ever going to, really keep our resort and our community running or catch up. So it's not one or the other to me, it's both. And I'm going to go ahead and, touch the third rail here, but I think we've reached a point where, given the increased demand that I'm anticipating from a windfall of county STRs surrounding our community, demanding employees, as well as the existing shortfall, and the fact that the city of Aspen is the only entity putting new dollars in for addressing shortfall, not new demand, but for addressing shortfall with our real estate transfer tax and the sales tax that is dedicated towards the shortfall, not mitigation. I think we need to really seriously consider, should the sales units at Burlingame be restricted to sales only to workers within the city of Aspen limits. And I think we're seeing that with Basalt's new projects. Their AH has to be sold to people who work within Basalt. And I'd be happy to walk away from this position if I start to see the county pursue a dedicated revenue source that will go towards shoring up the shortfall of affordable housing. But right now, all I see is mitigation, which leaves another 40 or 50% of the employees for each new residence unfulfilled and creating more shortfall, and actually $0 towards shortfall. So we're getting further behind every year with new growth when 40% is not mitigated. So I think we really need to start talking about how do we allocate the resources we have within our housing program, the new sales units, which are likely to be the last sales units to come up for a long time, and they're going to be costing significant city subsidy, should be really taking care of the businesses and the people who are generating the revenues that create that housing. So the sales tax is city businesses, and the other real estate transfer is the sale of all residential homes. I think we are going to have to start crossing that Rubicon and saying what we create with those dollars from generated within Aspen towards shortfall can only be sold to people working within Aspen to try to take care of that shortfall. But right now we're running this game with two arms tied behind our back, with a constantly increasing demand and constantly increasing shortfall created by new development that's only mitigating at half of its impacts. Thank you very much.
Then Ward.
Yeah, Rachel, I think what I had in my notes falls in line with what you're discussing, and I like the credit program in that it creates housing with a partnership with the private sector. But I also, a number of things like John mentioned building, existing buildings, so try to utilize those as much as possible. And I think when we went through this, we had a lot of discussion about multifamily free market and how could we maybe backfill those. Those are existing buildings. Skippy, I think, mentions a lot about adding capacity without adding construction, and anything that we can add without building or without paying for it 100% is a plus. It's a benefit to our workforce housing shortage. And I totally agree that as the credits program is now, it in essence creates shortfalls, because the only way you have a market for the credits is for mitigation for new development. So I'm wondering if there's a way that we can morph this business model of the credits program to encourage backfill from, as Rachel was saying, what in essence is a 150 fund and even the 505 fund, to put some public money in to help backfill, maybe using the if we can create the interest and the return on, I think a timeline and return on investment for the credits program is a stumbling block. It takes a long time for people to get their money out of it. But if there's a way that we can utilize some of those existing buildings to add capacity without construction, and Skippy's been kicking around an RO idea that I will not take the wind out of his sails on that. He can express himself better than I can express himself. So I think what I'm trying to get at is if we can find a way to morph the credits program into creating from existing buildings, free market, multifamily with backfill from public monies, that we would, I think we would get a benefit to the housing of our workforce.
Yeah. Hey, if I can add on to that really quickly, I think we've all talked about it a little bit before, but it was a prior council's decision that the city could not buy housing credits. But if we were buying some of the housing credits, they could be going towards the existing shortfall as opposed to just partial mitigation for new growth. And so I don't see that bullet point on here, but that is certainly something we've talked about. And I think it would create far more competition within the credit program and potentially see the credit projects come online quicker, because right now you have people who've bought the credit program, but because their commercial development isn't happening yet, it's Midland Park. It's all sitting vacant and unbuilt for years, for 2.5, 3 years now. So, if the city was able to go out and purchase some of those and be a competitor, you might see the people who want that for their commercial development saying, hey, we better go ahead and buy it and build it now. So I think that's one way to add both competition and potential dollars to the program for the developer, for, as Ward is saying, for the city to be in that game as well. Thank you.
Then Skippy?
Yeah, I think this slide is just such a great celebration of how awesome our staff is. There are other mountain communities that don't even have categories for housing yet or deed restrictions. And we're 10 years now past the credits program, and looking at the intersection between that and everything else. So do I support all this? Absolutely. Just want to draw attention and clarity to some of those intersections, right? I mean, a big part of what will make the credit program do what this says, increase program utilization, are things on other slides. And so, when we look at like GMQS mitigation rates, right, we're creating demand for those credits that doesn't exist. When we talk about changing underlying zoning allowances to allow for more AH density in residential zone districts, well, if I'm going to build a credits program and currently I can have 2 units, but in the future I can have 10, well, my ROI per unit changes. The equation changes. It becomes much more valuable for me to deliver those units. as Rachel said, if we start buying credits or parts of credits or providing the opportunity for the release of those funds sooner, working with banks on valuation, then that all becomes more attractive. So I think this is great. I support it fully. There's a lot more here than sort of meets the eye. And then around the generation and mitigation piece, you know, we absolutely need to do this. But to Rachel's point, we also really need to better understand the displacement piece and the vacancy piece. And that doesn't necessarily yield a result where we come up with a new mitigation number in some complex equation that says when this 1970s house gets demolished, you're displacing X number of workers, and so you must add this to the new thing. You know, the much more elegant and probably beneficial way is on the other side, right? We don't try to get into that math, but we just say, as long as you continue to use it in the way that benefits community, housing locals, fine. But when you stop using it for that condition and start using it in a displacement condition, such as vacancy for investment or STR, well, then you pay a fee or a fine. And that goes back into solving our housing crisis, right? I think that's probably where we land. But I think it's important that we better understand that picture from a quantitative perspective throughout this process. And then just to your question, which I think Ward answered, and I think we've all answered, you know, in 10 plus years of having conversations every damn day about housing, there's two questions I've almost never received a no to, right? The first one, I did receive a no. I know exactly where I was. There was two people that said no, but is, you know, do we need a housing program? Two people said no. Everyone I've ever met other than that gets it. And they're like, yes, we do. The next one is, if we could have affordable housing without development, or if we could have it with new development, would you prefer the non-development? I've never heard anyone say no to that. Everyone says yes to that, right? That's just such an obvious layup for our community. And it's gonna take time to build out a new model. But yeah, it's time to start. It's gonna be everyone's preference. And the way I've been thinking about this actually is it's like Apollo 13, when they figure out that they're not gonna have enough oxygen left. Like there is the booster tank that they kick on, and that's sort of the development model. Like we gotta keep doing that. But then they like walk into the room and they throw the stuff down on the table and they're like, guys, we just bought ourselves 4 days. And until you can figure out how to put that square thing in the round hole, these guys are gonna die. And like, that's sort of it, right? Like we need to solve for that equation. And that's using the existing infrastructure we have in a new way is the only way we're really not gonna die and make it back home.
John, over to you.
That is difficult to follow up on. I have no metaphors at my disposal. I do want to say I'm pleased with tonight's meeting. I'm stoked on Philip and Ben's focus on this issue, and I think we're on the right track. Thanks.
John? Ben?
Yeah, I think that the reference to things on other slides that those previous two items relate to can be found here. I think it's been clear across the country that kind of single solutions to affordable housing issues, whether it be getting rid of single family zoning, which a lot of communities have done, you know, isn't enough on its own. And so we've got to do a bunch of things together to kind of respond to that. And so connected to those previous two things, we do want to use the tools that we have in our zone district standards and calculations and measurements to kind of reduce the obstacles and create new incentives for the development of affordable housing. Really important to this is evaluating permitted and prohibited uses in specific zone districts. For example, we had a presentation to council several months ago about multifamily replacement and kind of opportunities for using existing multifamily to, you know, either for a credits project or redevelopment to 100% affordable. And one of the things that's interesting is that, you know, in the R6 zone district, in the Lodge zone district, where affordable housing and multifamily housing of a certain dimension is kind of creates these nonconformities for existing kind of multifamily. Like thinking about, again, kind of permitted uses and prohibited uses in specific zone districts, thinking about how that can be a discouragement to different kinds of opportunities for affordable housing is important. And then lastly, on the zoning topic, new and or kind of modified zone districts, thinking about dimensions for 100% affordable, thinking about, overlay districts or something that gives a little bit more certainty to the development of affordable housing. Right now, we do have an affordable housing PD zone district, but in order to utilize that, you've got to go through a rezoning process. And that can often be a fairly significant obstacle for a developer who's thinking about doing a project. Related to that in the review procedures, we're going to assess the sort of by right development of affordable housing. Right now, even going through a project that would otherwise be allowed by right in terms of dimensions, you've got to go through a planning and zoning review to get GMQS approval, which again, kind of adds time, adds costs, adds opportunities for people to throw stones at a project that is otherwise compliant with the land use code. And then lastly, just kind of going through all of our kind of administrative and board review standards and procedures to support our AACP policies and goals around affordable housing. And so the combination of these four things on affordable housing could be really powerful. And so it's not one of them by itself. They've all got to kind of be given some thought and some time and attention, but there's some real opportunity here to connect with other things that we're doing to really make some ground here. So any comments, thoughts about this? And then we've got one last slide, or actually two slides, kind of on the development review standards, and we can tie this up.
No questions.
Skippy, comments here?
Yeah, I just want to agree wholeheartedly. Thank you for focusing on this. I think the process part is something that often gets lost in the conversation and is so incredibly important, right? I mean, simply put, the thing that we most want should be easiest to do, and the thing we least want should be hardest to do. And the impact of that is really going to be tremendous. When I was in high school, I played football, and we had a dude and ended up going to the NFL. But food wasn't not allowed to be eaten in the house, but mom, my buddy's mom literally padlocked the refrigerator at night, right? Like that thing that they didn't want to all disappear immediately was hardest to get to. And, if you're trying to lose weight, putting broccoli on your desk at work makes a big difference. So I so appreciate us not overlooking these things. And for someone who's going to deliver what we most want, let's grease the skids and make it as simple and the path of least resistance possible.
Perfect.
All right, Ben, let's go to our next slides.
Okay. Lastly, we've got kind of development review processes as our fourth kind of policy area. In our problem statements, we've talked about a desire for a more efficient and predictable review process for all kinds of development, not just for affordable housing. Can we reduce loopholes that lead to undesirable outcomes? We know that happens on occasion. There have been questions about kind of the processes and outcomes in our review boards related to specific projects across town. And we want to make sure, this is kind of a redundancy from the last area, making sure that the barriers to approval of age development are not an obstacle or that are currently too high. And there's just kind of three areas here. We've talked about demolition previously, and this is more around the relationship of demolition to nonconformities in terms of process. Not necessarily, kind of a different tact on this topic than the conversation we've previously had this evening on demolition. This is more so the kind of intersection of definition and process and those triggers that we've talked about, and then also the relationship of demolition to nonconformities. It's process heavy, it's related to definitions, And we, in this area, it's going to be particularly important for us to look to other communities to kind of see how folks have organized these kinds of relationships. Right now, this is, I think, something that causes difficulty both for staff and the development community as we try to navigate this issue. Zoning standards, again, a little bit of redundancy from the affordable housing conversation. We want to look at permitted, conditional, prohibited uses across our zone districts to make sure that we're zoning it like we mean it and that we're not creating unintended consequences in our zone districts. And then lastly, kind of bringing together a few topics that have been discussed previously in different ways. Assess the, kind of by right development, administrative review, board review standards and procedures to ensure that they support community and climate outcomes related to the ACP and our climate goals that have previously been discussed in multiple ways. So these are these three kind of areas within this kind of process set of issues. We think that this would go a long way to helping us support some of the other ideas that have been talked about tonight.
I'm okay with it all. I think it's great work, as others have complimented you thus far. The only small footnote I would make is to the either AH by house or any sort of by right policies, in that we still maintain some sort of design standards or fitting with the character. I don't want to see a by right and then it's like, well, hey, I decided to paint the whole thing bright purple because it's by right, I can do anything I want. I don't think we're going to see that, but I do think without trying to add immeasurable cost to your projects, character and how they fit is also part of by right. Okay, thank you. That's my only footnote, and otherwise, thank you very much for all this hard work.
Thanks, Rachel. Ward?
Yeah, of course, I've got to add my comments to Philip and Ben for the hard work they've done and my appreciation for many months, not just for this work session. I had a couple of questions on what are the barriers for affordable housing developments for single family and duplex development? I needed some clarity on that. What are the barriers that we want to remove? And then also under to be able to list what allowed and not allowed uses are. New development, it seems to be easier to determine what's not allowed when it comes to new development, but for existing uses, can they be modified an allowable use? And what's prohibited? And can we have incentives to change a use to something that is more AACP friendly? So just a few questions there, clarity and my observation.
Yeah, Ward, very briefly, without getting into too much technicality, I think that the way GMQS currently operates, and this is, we've discussed this on numerous occasions. If you want to tear down your house and build a bigger house with a bigger basement, you're going straight to building permit, as long as you don't need any other kind of variances or anything else with your project. But the way that the way that growth management is set up, and I think I mentioned this just a couple minutes ago, that if you've got an affordable housing project that otherwise meets all of the underlying standards of the zone district, you've at a minimum got to go to Planning and Zoning Commission for growth management review and the issuance of affordable housing credits. And, I think to Rachel's point, we want to make sure that if we're sort of streamlining that process, we want to make sure that that development still meets standards that are important to us, and that will kind of translate into successful housing for the community. We want to make sure that that project, like a single family or duplex project right now, doesn't have to go through an expensive land use process that adds weeks or months to a project's timeline, that kind of opens it up to, and I think raises questions that we need, like more stringent review for affordable housing than we do for kind of single family and duplex development that is kind of running into, concerns that we have with the AACP. And so it's about some, and there are tweaks and there's some minor changes and there's some moving around of things from one section to the next, but it's basically, what we're thinking about. And, certainly this is a conversation like all these other things that we're going to be having over the next few months, that if we want more affordable housing, this is a place where we could make a difference to make affordable housing more desirable for the private sector to pursue, because it's more predictable, it's more efficient, it's more cost effective, but also for our own projects with the city. The lumberyard, to get through its process when we get to entitlements is going to be a major entitlement process in the development of affordable housing. Now, that's a kind of a project that's a different scale than a single lot, 100% affordable redevelopment on Main Street. But we want to make it clear to the community that that's something that we support, and as long as it's meeting standards, it's going to get through our process in a more efficient way. And those are the kind of solutions that we want to pursue in this area. So I can give more technical sort of examples of kind of other things that kind of can serve as obstacles to AH development, but there's some things that we could do if that seems to be a path that the community and council is supportive of.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for that. I definitely support by right affordable, 100% affordable housing. So I want to pursue that.
Thanks, Ward. Looking for any follow-up. Ben and Philip, the only thing that came out to me was in the first section when we were talking about short-term rentals under item E, financials, permit fee, impact fee. I understand that that's in the scope of what we're looking at, but I couldn't help but wonder about a possible taxing. I know that other communities are doing excise taxing and other items. So I'm not saying that it should be in this scope. I just want to make sure that that is in the conversation, I guess, just around the community's opportunities surrounding that. So just thought I'd bring that up.
Yeah, and I think the way that we're envisioning getting information to council and the community about that. Obviously, I think it's a baseline of understanding. We think that there are impacts in short-term rentals that are not currently being assessed. And I will just say that our consultant team of RRC and the EPS is going to be providing us with analysis of those impacts, and then the different mechanisms that we could perhaps implement in trying to kind of best capture those impacts, whether it be with a kind of a bigger permit fee, an excise tax, which is I think what Frisco is one of our peer communities is pursuing right now. So I think there's multiple ways to get at those impacts, and I think we're going to have a better understanding out of the work from our consultant team on that.
Okay, great. Not a problem. Just wanted to make mention. That's kind of the only thing that I was like, oh, well, I wonder where this fits into the conversation. Rachel?
Yeah, Tori, thank you for bringing that up, and I'm going to tag on a little bit. I didn't really see a lot on the financial in this presentation for us to discuss, and frankly, I may be bringing something up that has been deliberately pushed aside for some reason, but I really see it a little more as being in Pete Strecker's ballpark than ComDev per se. But I'm starting to get a lot of questions from people about, how do IRS regulations and your home fit in if it's rented for half a year? Is it commercial property by IRS as your second home versus, because you don't live there, it's not your primary residence. But are these companies reporting the income to the state of Colorado for income tax purposes? Do you cross a line if you rented it 300 days a year? You're now really a commercial property, not a residential property. Again, how does this all relate from the federal back to the state property tax question? Because, I've said it before, but short-term rental users are potentially going to put more pressure on our trail systems and need more trail rangers because they're out using it every week. It's all new. Versus someone who lives here year-round may go out periodically and they know the rules and they don't have to be re-educated every week. So you're going to have services that have always depended on a residential property tax being used at a commercial level and potentially creating shortfalls there. So I don't want to slow this meeting down. We all want to get to dinner, but I think that at least even answering for the public, when people ask me, are these people paying their fair share of Colorado tax? Are they paying tax on the income from this? Are they not? And I realize that with the proper and appropriate property management companies, that's not even a question. But people really want to know, what is this intersectionality between being a residential commercial property? Does it change your depreciation schedule? All sorts of things like that. And we've prior talked about the tax equity questions between a small lodge paying commercial property tax and an STR across the street not. So it's just that there seem to be more and more layers of questions that people are asking about that. And again, it's very different from the ComDev work. But I think it'd be great if we could come up with some sort of white paper or something like that that sorted out the relationships on the taxation level between what happens locally, what's the difference between a property tax and an excise tax, what's on a state level and what's on a federal level that define these things, because it's really odd, in my mind at least, to have a property that is generating tens of thousands of dollars a month in income at a commercial level and yet being called a residential property, so and I think that it may not happen this session, but you're eventually going to see the state address it because it's starting to affect their service levels too. That's all. Again, I'm not trying to add to this presentation, but there needs to be something there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Ben, back to you.
Good. Council, thank you. Super helpful comments this evening across these 4 policy areas. I think what I heard is general support for what we're proposing. I think there were a couple of really good additions and suggestions for refinement that I think we'll incorporate. So thank you for that. And thank you for your thoughtfulness throughout this process to this point. We talked a lot about public engagement at the beginning, and I did just want to throw a slide. This is out of the memo, just to kind of get, because with marching orders this evening, we're going to be launching into conversations with the community pretty immediately. And I just wanted to give a little bit of specificity to both council and I think the community who's watching, the different kinds of opportunities that people are going to have to be informed about what we're talking about here, and to find ways to get involved, either kind of one-on-one in interviews, conversations with staff, on the web, through social media. But there's going to be a lot of different ways for people to plug into this. We're working on building out Aspen Community Voice. We've got a couple of different focus groups. And we talked a little bit about this in the memo, kind of differentiating these focus groups. Kind of the difference between development industry professionals and people who just have a common interest in the topic, or maybe are a neighbor to a short-term rental that is causing them some grief. we want to give some space to folks to talk about those things in small groups. We're going to be having kind of broader conversations. We're still formulating exactly who we're talking and how we're going to organize this, but we want to get out into neighborhoods that may be by HOAs in different parts of town, presentations and conversations with them. Certainly, I see Megan and Carolyn on the line. Certainly, we'll be relying on our friends in the print and radio medias to get the word out to folks and let people know what we're working on. And then I do think we want to rely on our boards and commissions for good, solid input. Certainly P&Z, HPC, and APSHA, they wrestle with these issues all day long, and I think we want to make sure that we're reaching out to them and getting clear feedback from them. So lots of ways for people to get engaged, and you'll be hearing more about our specific plan, and we'll be launching our efforts here pretty immediately after this evening.
And Ben, I don't know what form that boards and commissions outreach will look like, but this would definitely be something that Next Gen would be hopefully looking into and giving us their input as well. So
thanks for that addition.
Thank you. Skippy, hand up.
Yes, this is great. I think, all of the above is the answer. Sort of one, I guess, request and one offer, if we agree. But, I just feel like, simply getting stuff out there, even if it's on all the platforms and expecting people to come to us is not what we're really hoping for. We're hoping to go out to community and say, this is a big deal. This is the time. Please come in. You're welcome, it's different. And so, I just think of my experience. I know it's the same for the rest of us. 5 to 30 people a day who I talk to about some part of this who, want to have some form of involvement, but then you walk away and they sort of get lost in the ether. So if there is some tool that can be run by the consultants or communication where, in real time, as we or you as staff or anyone else is meeting people, we can say, Tom Smith, housing and demolition, right? Whatever it is, but put them in somewhere and then make sure that we go back and touch them in some way. And so the offer is like my time or our time to do some of that outreach as well. I thought the process we used during COVID with businesses was extremely effective, right? We had some, simple technologically, but very effective staff work to give us a list of business owners. And then we had, some division of labor for direct outreach. And I found that direct outreach from council, being asked to join rather than having to seek it out, led to a really, really productive and useful process. So if there's, some kind of version of that worked, I think that could be really, really helpful.
Yeah. And I think to that point, Skippy, and I certainly agree with you, and I think the best conversations that I have are one-on-one, even on contentious issues that there might be some disagreement. I've really got to know several members of our community and had some really great conversations. And I would just encourage council, and you've been great at this to this point, but if you're getting messages or having conversations with people who you think would be good for us to talk to, who have expressed an interest to you that sort of get involved, please forward their names and some contact information to us. Be happy to do some direct outreach with them.
Ben, if I just run into someone on the corner of Paradise, right, and it's clear that they have some background in one of these things and they want to be involved, I want to be able to hand that off to you or to the team in a way that's most productive, streamlined, and not a nuisance, right, and ends up in the right place at the right time with the right info. So, whether it's here or just sending us an outline of how you want that, who it goes to, that would be really helpful, and I can make sure to do that.
Yeah, we'll put something together to give some guidance around that.
Thanks, Skippy. Anything last after that, Ben?
We just wanted to give one last sort of chance. If there's any last thoughts, we can talk about the moratorium. We can talk about ComDev's work plan. There was some information in your packet about all the other stuff that our awesome staff is working on. Next steps for this process, we're going to be finalizing our consultant contracts in the coming days. We're going to be launching our public engagement efforts, beginning policy analysis work very soon because we have to. We've got an ambitious program here and time's tight. So you'll be seeing certainly some messaging out in the community from us pretty quickly. We're anticipating coming back to you at a scheduled work session on March 1st to give you kind of a first update and probably have some new questions for you.
Thanks, Ben. And I just wanted to highlight for council specifically, this work session a few months ago was originally conceived as being focused on the community development work plan. And again, as I said off the top, for a variety of reasons, the moratorium work is the focus of much of the community development work plan now. But I will just highlight for council some important projects that are ongoing, including the lighting code update, which we budgeted for last fall, and which we are undertaking on obviously a much longer timeline than this moratorium process. We intend to come back to council later this year with some technical cleanups to the land use code. This is something we used to do every couple of years and we haven't done for a while, and there are some outstanding cleanups that need to happen just from a sort of straight legal and administrative standpoint. The environmental health department is working on the zero waste component of council's climate and waste goal. That work is ongoing. We will be updating the climate action plan, again, in response to the council goal, and that's memorialized in the work plan. The Building IQ program, you've had discussions about that recently. We will begin a legislative process and then begin developing the program at the staff level in response to council direction on that program. And those are just kind of the top line issues. And so again, giving short shrift to what is some really important work being done by other folks on the community development, environmental health and sustainability team. And again, our focus here tonight was very much in response to the June 8th deadline and all the work that this project team has before us over the next few months.
Got a hand from John.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank again Philip and Ben for furthering our outreach on this, the moratorium, educating the public on why we're doing what we're doing. And I'd also like to say that in the past 3 weeks, I've been to several other ski resorts, Winter Park, Steamboat, Alta, and Snowbird. And I just want to say, I think we're, as we all know, we're ahead of these other resorts in many areas, and I'd like to keep it that way. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Skippy.
Last thought, and then a thank you. Last thought is just in relatively short. I think it would be super helpful for me. I think I've learned a lot tonight. I think we've gotten a lot of clarity. We've taken a great step forward, and the memo that you presented is fantastic. It would be very helpful as sort of the next step. I would love to see if we could get this on one page. A one-pager that clearly and succinctly draws out for the community and frankly for me what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're prioritizing it. And I sort of sketched out a little workflow of what that looks like. I'm happy to share it. It's not important that it follows the format, but something that makes it really clear that I can hold in my hands and understand, and I can also hand to another community member and they can understand, and to literally get us all on the same singular page, I think would be a fantastic next step and a great exercise for organizing our own thoughts. Certainly would help me. That aside, I just want to say thank you. This is so much work. I mean, this is years and decades of work condensed into a 6-month period. There are not many communities in the world who could pull something like this off, certainly none that I'm aware of our scale. That is only possible because of not just your expertise, but your care for our community, involvement in it, and just deep desire to see it be awesome. And that's amazing to be part of. And so I just want to make that like abundantly clear. I'm so grateful to you guys and all of your work. This is just rad.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Ward doesn't have a hat on yet, so let's finish this before he puts one on.
Well, thank you, Mayor and Council, and you're scheduled to see us again on this topic on March 1st, and that will be the beginning of some pretty meaty policy and regulatory discussions. So, Ward, you might have to get some hats ready for us.
Thanks a lot, everybody. I'll see you at the next one.
Ciao, y'all.
Thank you, guys. Everybody have a great week. Talk to you soon. Thank you, Grassroots. Bye, everybody.
Good night, all.